Congratulations, you have made it to the end of Unit 2. By coming this far, you have accomplished several important things in your understanding of basic principles of economics. Number one, now you can derive and predict the behavior of the individuals both in simple demand situations and in more complex problems involving taxes or other interesting features of the environment. Second, you understand how to analyze the welfare or well-being of the consumer using the notion of consumer surplus, and you can compute it both in simple and in complex environments. Third, you have gained an insight of how economists really think, and in particular of this very important point that you can do a lot of economic analysis, both in terms of predicting out of sample and predicting what is the impact of the well-being of the consumer of changes in the world without knowing their experience utility function, without having to open their heads and know what that function is, or even if it exists at all. Why? Because you know how to recover the utility function that is being implicitly maximized from the observed behavior. So from that you can carry out every exercise. But also, and that's the last point that you have learned, you understand now that the extent to which you can carry out that extremely important exercise depends on a very important assumption, which is that the consumer is what we have called rational. In other words, the utility function that is being maximized to generate the behavior is really consistent with the utility function, with the experience utility function that actually generates the well-being, the pleasure, the hedonics of the individual. You understand that when there are no mistakes, when the individual is rational, when decision utility and experience utility are aligned, that exercise is valid. But now you've also taken your first steps in understanding how to model irrationality in applications like addiction or marketing soon in the problem set that you are about to solve. I hope that you have enjoyed the material on consumer theory on its own as much as I have enjoyed teaching it to you. But there is an additional payoff that I want to highlight in the long viewpoint of the course of having covered this material, which is over the next 2 units, we're going to put the simple material on consumer demand and consumer surplus that we have derived together with an understanding of how firms or companies make decisions to be able to understand how competitive markets work, what kinds of outcomes they produce, and when are these outcomes desirable or not. One comment on where, in my experience, most students are at this point in the course. So most of you are likely to fall in one of 2 groups. Some of you, as I mentioned in the previous unit, may have initially been very overwhelmed by all of the mathematical details and the modeling involved in this course. But the more you practice these things, as the weeks advance, the more you use first order conditions and derive predictions of the models, the more comfortable and you become with the math and second nature it becomes. And in 1 or 2 weeks, this is going to be second nature to you. So for you, if you find that very hard, I hope that you are starting to feel some progress and hang in there. In my experience, students who commit to master the material and hang in there eventually find this very intuitive and very easy. Now, you may also belong to a second group of students that is very common at Caltech, which are students with a very strong math background. Some of them know a lot more math than I know, but that are not used to modeling these fuzzy concepts that we encounter in economics in precise terms. In particular, they find very hard how to translate these fuzzy concepts of human behavior into precise models that we can solve. And that's where the difficulty comes. Now, this first unit has given you a very strong taste and introduction of how we do that in economics. And the more you practice, it's going to become very intuitive, very easy for you. Let me highlight some of the key ideas that we have learned in this unit so you focus your memory on them. So the first set of key ideas are about how to model behavior. So about modeling behavior. And the big idea is that the behavior in any situation theta, is a full description of the situation that the consumer faces, is determined by, given by a maximization problem over x greater or equal than 0 and x feasible given the environment of the utility, but not any utility, the decision utility function generated by that level of consumption of the good x. So if you want to characterize this, what the consumer does in any environment, you have to set up and solve this maximization problem. Now, we have seen that this decision that the consumer makes can either be optimal or a mistake. And that depends on whether, so if the decision utility that gets maximized is equal to the experience utility plus a constant, up to a constant, and is a mistake otherwise. Now, we've also been imposing a restriction to simplify things, is that we have assumed throughout that the utility function, either whether it's decision utility or experience utility, is quasi-linear. And we're going to stick with that for the entire course. Now, there is a special case that we have covered that is worth highlighting separately, even though it's covered in generally here, because it's so important for our study of competitive markets, which is there is the special case of free trade at price P, in which case we're denoting the optimal behavior by x star of P, the consumer demand at price P, and basically is given by the maximization of the benefit function of x plus W minus xp, given that x is greater or equal than 0. And notice that the feasibility constraint in that case is implicit on the fact that how much M you get to consume is just your wealth minus how much you spend on good x, given the price. And what we have learned is that at an interior solution, the x star, the behavior is characterized by the following first order condition, which is B prima at x star of P has to be equal to P. In other words, the marginal benefit of consuming another unit of the good has to be equal to its marginal cost, which in a free trade situation at constant prices is given by the price P. The second set of key ideas are about measuring welfare or well-being. And here I want to highlight three things. One is the definition of consumer surplus for any situation theta is just the utility, but not any utility, the experience utility that the consumer achieves when it does the optimal thing minus the utility of the no trade situation, which remember is when he consumes x star equals 0. And remember that there is a nice interpretation to the consumer surplus is the net benefit of going from the no trade situation to the utility that it actually experiences. Now, we've also seen that in general, the consumer surplus has a very natural interpretation, which is the integral from 0 to x star of P, x star of theta, whatever behavior is the consumer is doing, of the marginal benefit function, not any one, given by the experience utility function, the x minus the cost of x star of theta. Now, I'm writing this slightly different than I did it before, so I can give you the general lesson. Normally, this is going to be px star of theta, but as you will see in the homework, there are situations, where the cost that you have to pay is influenced by taxes and a bunch of other things, so it may be a little bit different. This formula gives you the exact consumer surplus in any case. And finally, we have looked at this notion of the change in consumer surplus from one situation to another, and that is just the difference in the consumer surplus, the final minus the initial. These are important formulas that you need to make sure you understand well. The final idea is that we can do a lot of economic analysis and prediction out of sample, etc., even if we don't know the utility function. So in particular, when individuals are rational, so if the consumer is rational, then we can recover the benefit function from the behavior, from the demand behavior that we observe in the market. And in particular, we do that by integrating under the inverse demand function, like we have seen. So B of x is going to be equal to a constant that is undetermined plus the integral from 0 to x to the inverse demand function, the area under the inverse demand function. Now, the other thing is that we can measure the consumer surplus, and actually the true consumer surplus of the consumer at P in a market situation, just by integrating under the inverse demand function. So the formula in this case is just this, that we have seen and used several times. Now, the other key thing that we have learned is that we can apply the tools when the consumer is irrational, he makes mistakes, but if there are mistakes, tools lead to incorrect answers. They don't really allow you to recover the true preferences or to measure true consumer surplus. We're almost done with this summary, but before we finish, let me give you some tips on how to solve problems in consumer theory. And these tips are based in having seen what kinds of things students like you struggle with in problem sets, in exams, in trying to develop their own models for things they are interested. So the first tip is that what is critical is to derive either x star of theta, the behavior, or the optimal level. What is critical is you must specify the maximization problem correctly. You have no idea how common it is that you get the wrong answer here, because when you read the description of the world, you specify the wrong maximization problem. And in particular, remember, this is important, that this is associated with decision utility, but this is associated with the maximization of experience utility. Second mistake to avoid, or second thing that is common, do not mix the demand function with the inverse demand function. Sometimes you need to use this, sometimes you need to use that in the formulas. Do not mix them. Students sometimes do that, and that leads to incorrect answers. And the final thing is, be careful when computing consumer surplus. Now, sometimes the best formula that you can use is this one. Consumer surplus situation is the experience utility of what the individual does minus the U of no trade. It's better to go to the direct route instead of trying to compute an area under the inverse demand function. Sometimes students, because the inverse demand, the area of the inverse demand curve function of approach works for the simple free trade case, they think it applies for everything, and that's not the case, and it can lead to mistakes. So think very carefully. Should I apply this formula, or can I just apply the standard rule of computing the area between the inverse demand function and the price? Finally, let me highlight the next step for the course. This week, the next thing that you should do is solve problem set 2. If you can, due to your time constraints, and you're not a student, or if you are a Caltech student, participate in Lab 1. And I urge you to be proactive in every week going back and reviewing the previous material. Multiple reviewing and going back really helps to learn this material for the long term. Next week, we're gonna do the unit 3 in producer theory, and we will also have a Lab 1 discussion session that will take place at Caltech, but will be broadcast in real time and then placed in the course website for those of you who cannot participate in real time.